Welcome back, everyone, to CyberTalk with Nikolay, Part 2, Threat Intelligence with Scott Scheferman.
And destructive attacks has never been higher than it is, and it's only going to escalate, again, out of necessity that we were speaking about earlier. And I think a lot of organizations don't understand that the 2 or 3 year long tail espionage campaign they've been dealing with, let's say with the SolarWinds as an example everybody's familiar with, can easily and instantly be turned to a highly destructive campaign at the flick of a switch. And that's dealing with, let's say, a nation state actor in that case. But it's also true of criminal actors. It's also true of the massive amount of hacktivism where 5, 10 years ago, hacktivism was like, yeah, we have to worry about hacktivists because we are an oil pipeline or this or that. Now it's like if you're in the West and you're a hospital, you have hacktivists in Russia that literally want to disrupt and break the patient workflow system of systems. They're not just in it for ransomware or a DDoS. Like that is all escalating at a rapid scale where disruption and destruction is a primary motive. And they don't have to worry about political will. They care about machismo and bragging and noise and headlines and attention. So that advances that timeline that I feel is the precipice upon we are standing, where those attacks will start to proliferate a lot more, especially in the West.
Got it. So that's kind of interesting. So one question came to mind while you were answering, is like, where do you see right now threats landscape is shifting, and where do you see the most destructive attacks coming from? Because if you look back, what you described, there are primarily like four different threat actors or groups that were operating, nation state, you got this hacktivism, you have script kiddies, as we call them, and then you have organized cybercrime. So it seems like notoriety, usually somebody who was making a lot of noise and trying to make the name for themselves, were either criminals or cyber criminals and script kiddies that they were trying to establish as a group. Activism, it's always was there, but they were discriminate. They were not doing indiscriminate attacks just to get the name. So they usually had a cause and they were going, and then we would not we didn't see a whole lot of noise coming from nation states. They usually were perpetrating really stealthy, really long attack lengths. They would stay in environments for extremely long time just to extract information that they need and then leave. So
Yeah.
do you see this right now kind of like shifting, and all those threat actors trying to make a lot more noise and create more, I don't know, havoc, hysteria in the space so that people will react accordingly, or how do
Yeah.
you see it?
Yeah. I'll break it into two camps. One is the nation state that you just addressed, and the other one I'll put it into the camp of extortion actors, ransomware, and other types of extortion. So on the nation state side, I think you know the political will shifts at some point in time. The presence that they have, the key presence inside of an enterprise or mission, has been there for years or a long number of months already. Let's just say from Russia as a use case, right? We all know they're in our power grids, they're in our hospitals, they're in a lot of our U.S. government facilities. They have been for some time. How effective has been the containment and eradication? Nobody actually knows. But suffice it to say, some percentage of that is still active, like let's just say even from SolarWinds on. And I think a lot of leaders need to realize that when that political will shifts, at some threshold, the value of the espionage, the value of being able to monitor information and understand the business workflows and the business processes of the target victim is maximized. That value, you get to whatever, 80%, 90% threshold of, I know all I need to know and I've gotten most of the intelligence I care about. And maybe there's some value in persistent intelligence and monitoring for certain organizations. But at some point, there might be a threshold where the value of disrupting that or destroying it or exposing it or extorting it becomes more valuable. And we don't often think in those kind of terms, but that's the way the world's moving. So that's the nation state answer. The extortion one, I think, is even more interesting because ransomware is malware that encrypts a hard drive, but that's not what we mean when we say ransomware as a threat. Ransomware as a threat is centered on extortion. And extortion works off of leverage. It's literally how much leverage can I exert to extract the max amount of ransom back to me. And right now, we're very familiar with double extortion, but that is playing out in a very interesting way where maybe you drop a payload, maybe you don't, but you've taken the information from an organization. Now, that information today is not the same story as it was before, where you're worried about customer information, PCI, PHI, etc. It's much more centered on intellectual property. In fact, when you look at the supply chain, where we worry about a lot, you see that intellectual property for the very top of the entire IT supply chain is being leaked because the victim didn't pay. And that includes source code, private signing keys, development frameworks, and not just of the victim, but from up and down the entire IT supply chain as well. And that's a big problem because that's the foundation of computing itself. So now you have actors, so if you don't pay, we're going to drop the information. And the impacts for that are tremendously long tail. So we're coming to this place now where, to bring it back to disruption, destruction for your question, if an actor can threaten to bring down a production network now, it's much more leverage for them than just encrypting enterprise laptops with a key that you can decrypt with. That's so yesterday, right? So going forward with hospitals, you look at a patient workflow, after they understand certain workflows, if they can disrupt that or turn those off and threaten to do so, that's more leverage under the context of extortion. And I see that's where things are going because you have so much more tooling and open source malware and frameworks to work with to then proactively bring down networks or systems of systems that are critical. But yeah, that's where I see things heading quickly, quite frankly.
Thank you for that, Scott. So now I think we sufficiently scared everyone who is listening. So let's maybe break a little bit down in small bites. And how would somebody get themselves better from the situation? Because what you just said, and I agree with it, a lot of people, and I've been in a lot of organizations when they develop playbooks, all they do is ransomware. They just address hard drive encryption. They don't look beyond that. It's like, okay, what kind of leverage somebody can have besides encrypting hard drive? Because yeah, okay, I have my backup, I restore and I'm happy. It's like, well, maybe the story didn't end there. So you may have a lot bigger problem when you have somebody encrypting your hard drives that you know of. So don't just jump on this case and say that's all I have right now with the incident. So how would the organization go about? Because there's a lot of different sources, a lot of different means and ways of slicing and dicing threat intelligence. And I've seen some organization, they starting to do it on their own. You have open source intelligence, you can ingest tons of different feeds, and then you need to separate noise from signals, and then you have some paid. It's like, from your perspective, what you've seen the most successful are, what would be your recommendations to say, hey, here's steps you need to take to understand threat intelligence, and then how you can apply to and contextualize to your environment?
Yeah, no, that's great. I'll take a use case just to make the point. A lot of us lived through NotPetya right after, on the heels of WannaCry. I worked a lot of those large incidents, and one of the things that we learned as industry during NotPetya was what made it really bad is it destroyed the master boot record, which meant you needed a new hard drive, right? If you want to restore, you can't just restore from cloud right off the bat. So now you go into operational environments and large organizations and stack of hard drives with OS images ready to go because we learned a lesson, hopefully. But if you look at that same actor and you look at the year 2023 and we're heading into 2024, that same Russian GRU actor with that motive, they wanted to contain that maybe to Ukraine and it spread out as a worm. But if you take the next NotPetya scenario, whenever that happens, tomorrow or 5 years, I don't care, right? Because now's the time to plan. And you take the same actor with the same techniques and tactics they are very capable of doing today versus 2017. Instead of destroying the master boot record, why not implant or brick the UEFI or voltage brick the BMC? Because now you have rootkits for boot kits for $5,000, which is zero barrier to entry effectively for an actor like that. And now it's all open source that summarily bypass secure boot for the first time in the world, right? October 7th last year, I stumbled on Black Lotus, and there it was for $5,000, a boot kit that's scalable. I mean, ransomware, you can plug it into any malware framework and you can hit hundreds of devices, bypass secure boot, and put in a UEFI boot kit. And from there, you could do a lot of other crazy bad things like mess up the UEFI. So now you need a new device at the motherboard level, not the hard drive level. And that subtle difference makes all the difference, because if you have a critical system with a stack of hard drives, maybe now you need a hot standby in your DRP for a very critical system, right? Or component in a system of systems. The same is true with all your externally facing devices that are, we have a massive supply chain problem, unlike we've ever had in terms of scope and depth of impact for your VPNs, your load balances, your firewalls, where there's an RCE out almost any given day of the week, and it's constantly being scanned by a Russian apparatus I happen to know about, right? That you can literally embed on those externally facing devices. In most organizations today, their playbook is, oh, they're using reused or stolen or paid for credentials from an access provider on the darknet to get creds into my VPN. Yes, that happens. But people don't realize a lot of those initial creds that are stolen off the device are because of a remote code execution vulnerability in the device that was exploited. They're sitting on the device, either creating new accounts or scraping all the admin credentials and selling those. But when you have that device as an attacker and you are root on the Linux kernel on that device, you have the ideal, the omnipotent position in the organization to do any objective or any payload or any motive you have. And these things are getting popped left and right at a crazy rate. Name a single vendor in that space, and I don't want to name vendors, but there are so many, all of them, in fact, that have remote code execution vulnerabilities coming out once or twice a month, or once every couple months for some. And if you're not looking at that device itself very closely, you can't just rely on its logs. You can't just rely on your current stack, the way you've been doing things. You have to really patch those devices immediately these days. You can't say, well, in 30 days, I'll bring down my VPN, because I can't do it now because it's not planned downtime. Or we have an exercise or whatever's going on. You have to literally stop what you're doing, patch the device, because the chance of it being immediately almost exploited are very high today because of all the automated scanning coming from all over the place. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, criminal actors. That's a new world. This conversation would not flow the same even 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's nice. Thank you, Scott. That's definitely a lot of information right there. And the question I would ask is, like, if you can dive a little bit deeper into what you just mentioned. You guys did some interesting recently discoveries in hardware, and you kind of briefly touched on UEFI and how destructive it can be. And essentially, yeah, you cannot just fight things out right now. You have huge operational problem once it's being destroyed, so you need to remove entire army of your devices, and you have to find a way how to operate your business. And in many cases, you'll probably end up going back to pencils and papers. So from that point of view, can you dive a little bit into like BMC or Gigabyte that's been written up and see what's going on there?
Yeah, well, I'll do the Gigabyte one first quickly, and I'll close with the BMC one. The Gigabyte one was something we found in a customer environment, which was effectively a backdoor from the firmware vendor for the motherboard. And that's never a good thing, right? Because those things do firmware updates, and you don't know. It was able to download and launch any executable, any binary it wanted to. You really don't want that at your motherboard level, because that is, the motherboard is literally pre-boot. It's omnipotence. It's literally has the root of trust at that level. And so your OS and all of your other security controls after you've done that as an attacker are disableable, evadable. You can evade them, just turn them off. Like it's BitLocker, Credential Guard, Microsoft Defender. All of those things we kind of rely on, even on the OS level controls, are all subvertible once you have that point of presence, and which that's why the attackers are going there, quite frankly. But so GigWire was a backdoor. Not only was a backdoor, which is a risk from that vendor, if you will, if the vendor is either compromised or themselves malicious. Not saying they are, but not only is that the threat model, but also the way it was implemented is easy to exploit on a network because they're using really bad HTTPS protocols. So any attacker in the middle, if you will, person in the middle could literally use that to send their own binary update to the motherboard on the network. So it's both vulnerability and a backdoor that was discovered in one of our customers via our solution. That made a lot of news, as it should. The second one is the one that we just spoke at I'll just describe it as a private conference with very important people from government and industry in the room. About 300 folks, including the director and head of CISO, Jen Easterly, and a few other folks like that. And we presented our research, and that was on what we call BMC and C, CNC being the play on words, command and control. But the long story short is it's a series of vulnerabilities, many of which provide unauthenticated remote code execution to the baseboard management controller. And if your audience isn't all familiar with BMCs, that's your lights out management for hyperscalers, data centers, cloud environments, the biggest ones in the world, the ones that all of our data are on, and all the ones you have yourselves as well. That's how you manage entire management networks of servers. And if you get to the BMC as an attacker, you have all the control. You can upload any payloads. You can mess with the UEFI settings and BIOS itself and the images that themselves. You have a KVM capability for espionage already built in. And these are native features of the BMC, let alone what our researcher, Vlad, was able to do, which was create an exploit in like 6 hours time that puts a server or an entire subnet of, managed subnet of servers into an infinite reset loop that the victim organization cannot thwart. Meaning you have indefinite downtime of unusable servers across perhaps your entire data center, depending on the credentials the attacker might have and how large those subnets are in terms of number of servers on devices on it, on the management network. The other thing we could do is use some of the other researcher, I'm forgetting who did the research, forgive me, but there's recent research on the same BMC stack where you can apply a voltage attack and fry the BMC chip. And that chip is a full Linux kernel. Like it's its own operating system there. It's the most amazing point of presence an attacker can have. And between infinite reset loops or bricking devices, you have a new threat model. Like the biggest environments, or even your own environments, even a small server farm. And not only that, NVIDIA did research as well and presented at DEF CON, another a dozen or more CVEs on the same AMI stack that allows for attackers to do all sorts of crazy things with unauthenticated remote code execution and a set of exploits to go with it. So I think what we're learning as an industry, there needs to be more research here because that code base is very complex, a lot of really old code borrowed from a lot of libraries that themselves have vulnerabilities that are open source. You put all that together, and we're going to continue to find lots of vulnerabilities in the space at the BMC level. And I'll tell you, after we were done talking, it was pretty silent in the room. And for the next 2 days, we have people coming up from us, from U.S. government, from all sorts of individuals and leaders saying, that was probably the most important talk. I'm glad I caught this because it was off-site, not actually at DEF CON. And that was on purpose. We really didn't want to necessarily present what we were able to present in that room at TLP red level.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, for that. Definitely the world is not improving greatly, but it does, I would see attacks are shifting from one area to the other where the link is the weakest, and I think that's what you've been talking about. So thank you, everyone, for joining us for part 2 with Scott Scheferman on threat intelligence. Stay tuned for part 3.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about these topics or IS Squared, please go to www.issquaredinc.com.